So welcome everyone. It's so nice to see so many people from throughout the watershed and from other water organizations joining us here this evening. My name is Margot Gia and I am the Natural Resources Planner at Windham Regional Commission. But tonight I'm on the steering committee for the Saxtons River Watershed Collaborative, one of many people involved in this collaborative that's been together, loosely together for quite a few years now, probably 5 or 6 years. And it is made up of people from representing the towns of Windham, Grafton, Westminster, and Rockingham. There's people that are both representing town officials as well as residents from all those communities. We also have participants from water organizations that are both regional and statewide that also participate in the meetings. And the Watershed organization really wants to be looking at our watershed, the Saxtons River watershed, as a whole. We tend to look at the pieces that are close to us. So if we live in the headwaters, maybe we think of the watershed as being a network of small little streams. If you live down near the mouth, you're thinking of a bigger river that has a lot coming down from upstream, passing through it. So we all tend to be looking at just a piece of the watershed, and the chance for all of us to be in a room together talking about the watershed as a whole gives us an understanding of how we can look at this whole system as a whole and think about flood resiliency in its entirety. So tonight we are going to be we're on this Zoom platform. My guess is that most of you are fairly familiar with this platform by now, but I just want to go over a few little quick features in case you're not. Down in the bottom, if you run your cursor down to the bottom of your screen, a very handy toolbar comes up. And the most important thing is the mute button. If you're not talking, I'm going to ask that everyone be on mute, and you would just do that by clicking on the mute button in the far left in the bottom corner. If you do want to ask a question, you would just unmute yourself and then you're able to speak. If you are having trouble with your bandwidth this evening, another option is turning off your camera, and that will allow you to have better audio than if sometimes having both audio and video up. Although we always love to see people's faces if you want to have your video on. So this evening, when our presenter is speaking, he's going to have a lot of slides, and if you have a specific question about something on the slides that can be answered quickly, then please feel free to jump in and ask our speaker, whose name is Ryan, I'll introduce in just a minute, a question about that slide. If you have a question that's more of a discussion question, or maybe something that requires a longer explanation, then please hold that for questions at the end of his presentation, and we'll have a large chunk of time available for questions where we can have more of a dialogue about that. But we want to make sure that people are understanding the slides and the science of water quality as it's being presented. So with that, I would like to welcome our presenter this evening. So our presenter is Ryan O'Donnell, and Ryan wears many hats, but in the Saxtons River watershed, he works with the Southeastern Vermont Watershed Alliance as the water monitoring coordinator, and SEVWA, that's short for Southeastern Vermont Watershed Alliance, also has a connection with the CRC, which is the Connecticut River Conservancy, where Ryan also is the water quality monitoring for that organization. So Ryan does a lot of water quality monitoring all throughout Southeastern Vermont, and with Connecticut River Conservancy, it actually crosses borders. So we're really excited to have Ryan here this evening. And I should mention that the work that Ryan is going to be presenting on the Saxtons River tonight is all data that has been collected through SEVWA and its cadre of volunteers. We have a dedicated group of volunteers who every year go out and monitor the sites along the Saxtons River. And we really appreciate their time in going out and collecting this every other week data throughout the summer months. So thank you, Ryan, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And in addition to her position at the Wyndham Regional Commission, Margot has been helping me manage those volunteers for as long as I've been involved with SEWA. So thank you to her as well, in addition to the volunteers. So I have a presentation. All right, I think, can you see my PowerPoint? Okay. And if you have a question that you're afraid you're gonna forget, you could also throw it in the chat. I won't keep an eye on the chat while I'm presenting because that's too many windows. But
I will keep my eye on the chat so that if it's appropriate, yeah, I can break it in there or ask it later.
Absolutely. All right, so here is my presentation on the Saxtons River water quality. I'm actually really excited to be doing this. The Saxtons isn't one of my problem watersheds, and so I don't get the chance to really dive into this water quality that much, but I learned a lot going back. So I'm going to look at data going back to 2015. So just a refresher, I think we all know what a watershed is, but just a reminder that a watershed is the area of land that drains into a body of water. So here we have, the main stem of this river that's encompassed by this land, and this bear and the Yeti are not inside the watershed. And that's just a reminder that everything that happens on the land really affects the water quality and the creatures that live in it. So what affects water quality? I mean, a lot of things. Like I said, everything that happens on the land can have an effect. But these two figures really illustrate it well. And so if you've seen me present before, you've probably seen these figures. So on the left, we have kind of a graph of how rainfall ends up when it falls on different land uses. So on a forest, all of the water ends up either going to groundwater or taken up by trees or evaporation. That's what evapotranspiration is. It's a fancy word for evaporation mixed with plants drinking up the water. On a pasture, you're getting, also a lot of groundwater and a lot of evapotranspiration, but you're starting to see this red color, which is surface runoff. And runoff is just water that hits the ground and goes straight into the nearest body of water, and it will often pick up anything that it encounters and bring that with it to the stream. Once you get into the suburbs, not quite Saxtons River, but in the suburbs where you have houses and more lawns and more roads, you're starting to see more runoff and less, especially deep infiltration of groundwater. And then when we get to a city where you have almost all impervious surfaces, impervious means the water can't get through. You have almost all impervious surfaces. Almost all the water that would fall on a city goes straight into the nearest river. And you can see this in the figure to the right, where the black line is the rainfall, and then the pink line is what the river level would do normally if it was an undeveloped stream. And so you would see a low rise to a peak and then an equal fall. However, when we are developing the watershed and we're increasing that amount of impervious surface, what we see is both a quicker and a larger peak. And so you're getting more water into the river quickly. And so you see a flashier response, like flashy, like think flash floods, quick change in water levels. All right, so here's a look at the Saxtons River watershed. Oops, all of your faces are blocking my view of my notes. So here's a look at the full watershed with the water lines. So those are all the little streams in dark blue, but then also it's over the Google Maps base map to kind of help you get your bearings of where the watershed kind of starts and ends. So here's the water quality monitoring locations from the past 6 years, going back to 2015. Each site has been sampled for E. coli, total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and conductivity. In years past, we sampled for turbidity, and I'll explain all of these when I get to them. But we kind of stopped turbidity because Savoie's rivers were doing well, and it's expensive. Anyway, so I won't, even if you are volunteering and you sampled for turbidity and you're wondering why I'm not talking about it, that's why. It's older data and we were doing pretty well. Anyway, so this is on the Google satellite base map, just to give you more idea about the land use, where we can see fields and houses and roads closer up, but also it's an imagery that you might be familiar with if you're ever looking on Google Maps. I know that I've learned that I spend a lot more time looking at Google Maps than most people because I'm always looking for places to sample water quality. So here's a little bit about our sites. We've sampled 8 different sites in the past 6 years. Savoie does what's called targeted monitoring. That means that we are sampling specifically to sources of pollution. That means that if a site is doing really well for a number of years, we might stop monitoring it because we would expect it to keep doing well. Also, we have limited resources, so we move sites around. So if a site is doing well or we think that it's not capturing the upper end of a potential source, we would move it around to better locate the source. That makes it very hard to compare results year to year when we're changing sites, but it does help us locate sources. Also chose to go back to 2015 so that we have 5 years of data for the other parameters besides bacteria, since unfortunately due to the pandemic, we were only able to sample for E. coli bacteria at a limited number of sites in 2020. So we have the name of the sites first, where help you get an idea of where the sites are. They're often, if they're not a swimming hole, I do leave them intentionally vague so that when we post the results online, if it's in somebody's backyard, I'm not going, hey, go swim in this person's backyard. So then we have the river mile, which is how far upstream it is. So river mile 0 is basically the mouth at the Connecticut River. And so Stickney's field is the highest we monitor. Looking at the below the wastewater treatment facility site, we actually moved that mid-season in 2016 because DEC asked us to, the Department of Environmental Conservation, because we were actually capturing samples in what's called the mixing zone. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later, why we moved it. And then just here's a look. It's a rainbow because that's fun, but here's just a look at the different sites and what areas of land drain to each site. And in particular, what new areas of land each site captures. So when we're moving sites around, we're really trying to capture these different portions of land that are draining to each site. All right, So I wanted, in addition to moving our sites, one of the reasons it's so hard to compare results from year to year is because the stream flow is different each year, as you know. We only sample up to 6 times at each site, which is more monitoring than is happening in many locations around the state and the region, but it's still an incomplete picture. So for assessment or comparing across years or across watersheds, we are aiming to capture low flows and dry weather with our sampling. We learn different information from other samples that are during moderate or high flows or after a wet weather event, also known as a rainstorm. To clarify, high flows are kind of the upper 25% of flows of all time, and low flows are the lowest 25%, and then the moderate is the middle 50. It's very confusing to explain, but I put the lines here to help you see that. And now we're all probably a bit more familiar with different scaled graphs than we used to be, but this here is the linear scale. So each unit, in this case, a cubic foot per second of stream flow is given an equal space. This lets us see how high the high flows. In particular, in 2017, we had quite a high flow, or two. But it's really hard to see the low flows compared to each other. It's way easier for us to kind of understand linear flows, but we've gotten a lot more used to seeing these exponential or logarithmic scales. So this is the same data, but it's on a different scale, and this lets us compare those low flows more easily, in addition to still seeing those really high numbers. So you can see that 5, and then 50, and then 500. So here we can see that 2020, which is in red, got really, really dry. And we all know it was a drought this year. And then there was also a drought in 2016, which is the light blue. And then there's a drought at the beginning of 2018 as well, which is this brown color. So we've had a few droughts in the past 6 years. But we also had some really high flows. So once again, just showing that each year is very different, and we're each only sampling on 6 points each year along this. So first parameter I want to talk about is probably the one you might see the results for most frequently. It's kind of the easiest to explain, and that's E. coli bacteria. E. coli is a bacteria that is found in the guts of warm-blooded animals, including humans, and its presence in water is an indication that the water has come into contact with human or animal waste. So it's used to determine the level of risk for recreation. There are 2 types of recreation defined in the standards: primary contact, which is swimming, wading, coming into direct contact with the water, meaning that it's likely that you would get actual water or droplets of water in your mouth or other mucous membranes. Secondary contact is indirect contact with the water, so boating, jet skiing. That's not really happening that much on the Saxtons River, I don't think. So I'm only going to talk about swimming because you're more likely to just be directly in the water. E. coli is what's considered an indicator organism. So it's often not the E. coli itself that would make you sick. But because it is numerous and easy to test for, we can use it to indicate whether or not the water has a source of human or animal waste contamination, and whether there might be other organisms that would make you sick. Also, as we know, sometimes E. coli can itself make you sick. Sources of E. coli include agricultural and urban runoff, failing septic systems, a leaking sewer, pet waste, or wildlife waste washing into the river. And we see increased levels after rainfall. So we do recommend that in all rivers, wading 24 to 48 hours after a heavy rainstorm. And for our purposes, we define a wet weather as anything over 1/10 of an inch of rain in 24 hours. So I'm going to present each parameter's data to you in a few different ways, each of which is imperfect. And it's a lot of numbers. And it's a lot, so I know that, and I'm just trying to visually represent it the best way that I can. So these line graphs are an attempt to compare year by year, split into dry and wet weather, and represent the data spatially. So across the bottom, we have the river mile going from upstream to downstream, left to right. So remember that 0 is the Connecticut River. And then you'll see this geo mean or G mean, and that's stands for geometric mean, which is a different way of averaging numbers that we use for biological numbers because they tend to have large variations due to living organisms clumping together. So from these graphs, what I see is, here we have the swim standard at 235, the red dotted line. And I see good numbers in dry weather for the most part. And then we see very variable numbers in the wet weather. And some of that is because it depends on how wet the wet weather was. There's a big difference between 1/10 of an inch and an inch rainstorm and how much stuff it might be bringing into the river. But we see high numbers observed at all sites one time or another, which is not unusual. So I also wanted to take a look at each site's numbers based on the flow level. If you're a volunteer, you know that you note this on your field sheet as an observation. But since the Saxtons River also has a USGS gauge, I was able to correlate each sampling event to the flows and get a truly exact number based on those quartiles that I was talking about earlier. So these aren't broken down by rain, so it's important that that moderate flow is capturing a variety of wet and dry weather, which you can see there's a high thing. So these bars are the range. So it's just the minimum and the maximum that has been observed at each site. And then the little black star is the average, the geometric mean or the average. And then we have the swim standard as a dotted line in red. So what I found interesting is that the high flows are lower than the highest numbers observed during moderate flows. And this tells me that whatever the sources are, they're probably related mostly to runoff based on the previous graph. And these sources are getting diluted during those very high flows. And despite high numbers being observed at all sites at one time or another, these geomeans look pretty good to me. Of course, there's always room for improvement. We've identified the area of Barbers Park Road site as a potential upper end of sometimes high bacteria levels, even in dry weather. But we haven't identified a specific source, and that source was pretty quiet in 2019, and then we weren't able to monitor that site in 2020, unfortunately. So we'll go back to that investigation next year. And then I know everyone wanted to see if there were any trends from year to year, which is, like I said, very hard to tell. To best compare, I took only low flow and dry weather samples and averaged them and compared them here. Fortunately and unfortunately, I don't really see any trends. So it's not getting better, it's not getting worse. And these are all below 120, which is well below the swimming standard, so that's good. All right, on to nitrogen. So nitrogen is one of the 2 nutrients that we sample for. It's a nutrient affecting plant growth. If you're a gardener, you might be thinking about putting nitrogen onto your garden. But of course, we want to keep any excess nitrogen out of our rivers. So it's what we call the controlling nutrient in saltwater ecosystems. So while nitrogen and then phosphorus, which I'll talk about later, both contribute to increased plant growth in both saltwater and freshwater, it seems like nitrogen is the primary controller in saltwater. Why do we care about nitrogen then? The Saxtons River is not saltwater. Well, after it goes into the Connecticut River, the river from the Saxtons River eventually ends up in Long Island Sound, which is saltwater and does have a nitrogen problem. There's dead zones in the Long Island Sound every summer, and they are attributed to high nitrogen levels. So obviously we don't want to be contributing to that if we can help it. So total nitrogen means it counts all forms of nitrogen, including nitrates, nitrites, ammonia, and the sources of nitrogen are agricultural runoff, wastewater, so treated wastewater even has high in nutrients, and a failing septic might be leaking nutrients as well. So nitrogen is very mobile, and so the levels are actually less tied to the rain because it's just always in the water, it's always flowing downstream. All right, so the first thing you might notice is that on the dry weather map, my 2015 line goes off the chart here. And that's because that's from our below the wastewater treatment site. So I let it go off the site because otherwise you couldn't see anything. So after Irene, the river moved away from actually the discharge pipe of the treatment plant. That was resolved, but while the original 5.0 site was downstream of the designated mixing zone, which is a regulated zone where you're waiting for the treated wastewater effluent to kind of mix in with the river water. Our results after Irene suggested it's possible that that site was no longer outside of that regulated zone. And so we were capturing samples that were more treatment effluent than river water. So in 2016, we were asked to move our site downstream to 4.7, which we call off of Oak Street. And it's not the ideal move because it actually now captures another tributary, but it is downstream of the mixing zone, and it has safe and consistent access, which is very important to me, and making sure that the volunteers are safe. So here, apart from the high levels coming from the wastewater treatment plant, you can see that the numbers are pretty similar in wet or dry weather, and are actually a little lower in wet weather because it's getting diluted. If we look at the flow levels, you can see just how high we were seeing some levels below the wastewater treatment plant. So this purple line, I forgot to mention, is a suggested level. The Vermont standard is actually really, really high. It's 5 milligrams per liter, and we just don't see numbers that high, and really shouldn't be seeing numbers that high. So I use this 0.38 level, which is based off of what a number from an EPA study that suggested that that was a healthy level of nitrogen in our eco-region, so based on our temperature and precipitation and the type of forest and the type of geology that we have. So once again, these are broken down by flow levels, and what you can see here is, apart from the wastewater treatment plant, that you can see that nitrogen does tend to get diluted the more water there is in the river, which is different than we saw with the E. coli.
Hey,
and in general, it looks pretty good to me. Yep.
There was a question from Peter Bergstrom. He's wondering why there's no total nitrogen in 2020, because it was in Samplepalooza. Maybe you can explain Samplepalooza versus this monitoring.
Yeah, this is just the La Rosa partnership results, which is the program that we participate in. The Samplepalooza occurs in September outside of our normal monitoring season, and it's only a single sample. So we would only have one point on our graph for Samplepalooza. And also I am still waiting on the chloride result and then the finalized result. So I haven't had a chance to go through and quality check our results, which is what I do. If you're a volunteer, you know that you sometimes collect duplicates and blanks, and I actually have to go through all those numbers and make sure everything came out okay before I'm using any of these results. Which I actually should mention that the 2020 bacteria results, I haven't quality checked yet. So there might be a mistake or a typo or a contaminated sample in them, but they look good to me just glancing at them as a whole. So I actually, I considered talking about Samplepalooza in this presentation, but I didn't want to go too long. But I will, if you're curious about that, I can talk about it more some other time. I think that's all I was going to say about this. So once again, looking at trends, what I see is generally an increase from upstream to downstream, which is to be expected. But there's not really a trend. It looks like there was an increasing trend and then it came back down, but I checked, and 2016 and 2019 were like drier years, were just lower river levels than 2017 and 2018. So it mostly has to do with how much water was in the river, what the levels were. And more, I think, how much water was coming off the land into the river. But these were still mostly good numbers. Onto our other nutrient, total phosphorus, which is also a nutrient affecting plant growth. This graphic shows you all the different sources that it could be coming from and where it's stored. So like how nitrogen is the controlling nutrient in saltwater, phosphorus is the controlling nutrient in freshwater. And that's why you hear a lot about phosphorus if you're living in Vermont, and that's because it's really heavily affecting Lake Champlain. So total phosphorus, the total means that it counts all forms of phosphorus, including organic, inorganic, dissolved, suspended. If you're familiar with chemistry, that'll mean something to you. If it doesn't, if you're not, it doesn't, that's fine. The point is that it captures all possible forms of phosphorus. And then, you know, the sources that we would expect to see it from are similar to nitrogen: agricultural runoff, wastewater, failing septic systems. And the interesting thing about phosphorus is that it's very sticky. And so it sticks to sediment in particular, but it'll stick to anything. And if you're a volunteer, you know that you collect the phosphorus sample in a glass vial. That's just because the glasses holds less, like the phosphorus gets less stuck to the sides of the glass than a plastic container. And so it's transported with sediment, which means that we see that the levels of phosphorus in our rivers are really affected by rain events, and it's not the rain itself, it's actually how turbid or cloudy the water gets and how much dirt and stuff, sediment, is stirred up into the water when it rains. So here's our good old line charts. Once again, the wastewater treatment site is off the charts during dry weather, and so we can just see why we needed to move that site. If we continue to see those levels at our new site, we know there was a real problem, and not that we were just picking up effluent. So big differences in wet and dry weather. As you can see, much higher in wet weather. Like bacteria, I think a lot of the differences from year to year in the wet weather is how wet that wet weather was, and how much sediment was picked up. like bacteria, I think, you know, in 2017, it seemed, in 2018, it seemed like the Barbers Park Road site, which is 3.6, but mostly 2017, that it might have been a source of phosphorus in addition to bacteria. But it was quiet in 2019, and we weren't, like I said, able to look at it this year. So that will be another thing that I'm keeping an eye on, assuming we resume sampling for nutrients throughout the watershed next year. So here we have the flows. And you can see the wastewater treatment plant was capturing a lot of phosphorus, but this site, it's pretty consistent with the rest of the river. You can see that the high flows are actually a little lower levels than the moderate flows, and I think that might be due to dilution, except for at this Barbers Park Road site, which might be near a source. And we're seeing that maybe that source is active during high water. But when we're comparing to this red dotted line, the Vermont standard for Class B waters, which the Saxtons River is, we're only looking at those low flows, and our low flows are doing very well. Once again, no real trends, which is good because it's not getting more phosphorus-y, but it's not getting less phosphorus-y either. But they're all meeting the standards, so that's good for the most part. So the last thing that I want to talk about is the specific conductance, which I mostly refer to as conductivity, but they're actually slightly different. So this is a general monitoring parameter. It's kind of a catch-all. What it measures is actually how well the water conducts electricity, which is an indication of how many ions are dissolved in the water, which is a fancy way of saying how much stuff is in the water. So it comes from a variety of sources, road salt, runoff generally, but it also can come naturally from the geology if you have minerals that are dissolving into ions into your water. This is a parameter that tends to become diluted with rain. And we monitor it because it's very easy to monitor for. Sevla has a meter. So we just, it's something that I or one of the interns monitors ourselves. And it may catch other impairments for things that we're not monitoring. So it might catch a road salt impairment, it might catch, I don't know, some sort of metal contamination, something like that, that we're not monitoring for, but if the conductivity suddenly changes, we know that maybe there's something we should be looking for. So the difference between specific conductance and conductivity is specific conductance is adjusted for temperature, which is actually what we do, so you can compare them across different samples, which are obviously different temperatures. And then conductivity is different based on the temperature. So the conductivity is easier to say. So that's usually what I say. And this just is a chart showing you the different levels. So freshwater streams, it says 100 to 2000. In my experience of monitoring, our levels are usually between 50 and like 250. And by our levels, I mean like throughout Vermont and Massachusetts. So there's no real standard, so it's just interesting to look at. You can see in 2016 catching that wastewater runoff or effluent, but you can also see that the numbers in general are lower in wet weather. but if I was looking at this chart and I saw, like, if I saw this spike in 2016 and I didn't know that there was a specific source of ions, right, the wastewater treatment plant, I might go investigate that area to see why there's a sudden spike. And if you look at the different flows, this one is very clear that it gets diluted in rain. And that in general, it increases from downstream to upstream. One thing that I would know is that if, while it does get diluted in higher flows, if we had a continuous logger, so like something that you installed in the stream and was taking measurements every 5, 15 or hour, you know, continuous measurements over a period of time, once it started raining, we might actually see a spike due to residual road salt running off. But that's not something we've done, but it would be something that that we've seen in other New England streams. That road salt really sticks around, and then you get this little pulse of salty water coming through every time it rains, even in the summer. So my conclusions on the Saxtons River, and like I said, I'm really glad to have this occasion to go through this data in this really detailed way, figuring out how to present it best to you. Often I look at each year, I make observations, and then I have to move on to the next year. But looking at the past 6 years, the Saxtons River really does tend to have good bacteria levels during dry weather, but not after rain. That's not atypical for our region. Most of the rivers get high bacteria after rain, unless they're in straight up forest and there are no houses or roads anywhere. The wastewater treatment facility is sometimes a significant contributor of nitrogen and phosphorus. Although that is attenuated, that means that those numbers come downstream, come back down once you get downstream. There was likely another source of nutrients and bacteria in addition to the wastewater treatment plant, somewhere near the Barbers Park roadside, but it may have resolved, and I look forward to monitoring in full force again next year to see if that's true. And then overall, I think the river and the watershed is in pretty good condition, but it could always benefit from reduced runoff. So in addition to answering all of your questions, I also want to ask you a couple questions, and I'll grab a piece of paper so I can write things down. But I really like doing these presentations and talking to the people who live in the watershed, because you know, sometimes I'm like, I don't know what could possibly be causing this problem, and someone's like, well, I live right there and it's this. So you know, and I want to know what your concerns are. Where would you like to see us monitor in the future? Are there any areas that you're concerned might be a source of pollution, either nutrients or bacteria? And then, of course, I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. And Margot, I saw you laugh when I said people know things, but one time I was presenting in Brattleboro and I said, I don't know what happened in 2014. And they were like, oh, some guy was emptying his septic truck directly into the river and then he got arrested. That's what was happening in 2014. So, you know, important information to know if you're looking at bacteria levels, if someone is emptying septic waste into your river. So anyway, I'll open it up for questions and input. And I can actually take it off screen share.
So if you do have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in and ask a question. Peter?
I had a question, Ryan. What effect, if any, do you expect from the new wastewater plant in Saxtons River? Do you expect the phosphorus to go down?
I don't know much about the facility itself, but I I know that one of the things that they're doing now with newer systems is reducing the nutrient pollution. You know, when they first put wastewater treatment plants in, the goal was to get, you know, literally the solid waste out of the river and the bacteria. And we're now realizing, you know, the water's running clear, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's clean. And so, yes, I would expect to see less phosphorus coming from a new plant.
So we might see that in 2021.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So I have a question, Ryan. The oil and gas and so on and so forth from along highways which run along the Saxtons River, do you monitor at all for that? And what are you seeing as their contribution to the integrity of the river?
So we don't monitor, that would be monitoring for hydrocarbons, and we don't monitor for that because it's very expensive, and I think it's hard to, in part because it's hard to sample for accurately. But, you know, I think that's something that we would see. Many of our roads are right along rivers, and that is concerning, but it's not something that volunteers monitor for in general. I will say that we do have, on our field sheet, when volunteers collect samples, they are asked to make visual and olfactory observations. So they would know, and it's even a checkbox on our sheet, if the river smelled like gas or they saw an oil slick on the water, they would note that on their sheet. And if I saw that more than once, I would definitely, you know, alert somebody that there might be some sort of issue there.
Ryan, I'm going to ask a question that came in earlier today for someone who wasn't able to be here this evening. And the question was, you know, we have a lot of wells. You know, a lot of our watershed is not on like a town water system. And so there's a lot of wells that are close to the river. And the person was wondering how much, you know, does the river contamination or non-contamination affect what's happening in wells?
I'm not a groundwater expert, but it's my understanding that in general, in you know, a wet climate like New England, for the most part, groundwater is almost always just contributing to the river, and so it's flowing from the ground into the riverbed. And often wells, you know, it depends on the well, but often they're drilled pretty deep, and so you're accessing deeper groundwater. And so it is unlikely that bacteria from the river is making its way into your groundwater system. I think that's more of a problem somewhere where the aquifer is very shallow, like Cape Cod has that problem sometimes. You know, and that's also very sandy, whereas the Saxtons River area is very rocky, so that helps too. So I don't think it's a concern, but like I said, I'm not an expert. And actually, if someone were to set up a really big water withdrawal, they might start pulling too hard on the aquifer and pull water from the stream into the groundwater. But I still don't know if that means that it would make it, you know, bacteria and other contaminants would make it all the way to your well. But that's more, we see that problem more in Connecticut than we do in small rural parts of Vermont.
Thank you. I guess I also want to jump in, seeing as I don't see anyone else with their hand up currently. A couple weeks ago, we had a presentation from Marie Canuto on about the status, kind of the current status of the Saxtons River watershed. That presentation is available online at the Windham Regional Commission's website. If you are interested, go to the Natural Resources page. And one of the things that she noted for Basin 11, which includes the West River and its tributaries, the Williams River and its tributaries, and the Saxtons River and its tributaries, is that currently the biggest contributor of nitrogen into the Connecticut River from these river systems is mostly from septic. So it's kind of an interesting, usually we think of nitrogen coming from farm fields and agricultural systems and maybe some more, urbanization areas, but it's probably septic systems in our region that are either failing or leaking a little bit and contributing towards the nitrogen levels that are going into the Connecticut River. And that was just an interesting and kind of surprising data point that I picked up from that presentation that ties right into what you were talking about, Ryan.
Yeah.
So does it, oh, Gloria?
Oh.
Going along with that, and I know, Ryan, you're working on the tactical basin plan with SEVLA. The question I have is, going along with these septics, is there some way that septics that are close, homes that are close to the river can be sort of mandated to be checked? I mean, that may be something that comes from the state, because, I honestly think that a lot of people have no idea that their septics are leaking. But if we had a chance to, once every X number of years, they were checked at the site where it would go into the river, might save us some problems.
That's a great point, Gloria. And I'm maybe somebody from Grafton who's online might be able to speak to this a little bit better than me. I just remember from years ago, I worked in Grafton, and the site that I worked at the time that I was working there, all of a sudden Grafton passed a regulation that septics had to be pumped every X number of years. And I remember at the time that we didn't even know where our septic system in this new facility was.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great, in my mind, thing that the town of Grafton did to really get people aware of, maybe I should be paying attention to my septic system. But I know Kathy's on from Grafton, and there's several others, and maybe, it's been a little while since that was passed. Kathy?
Yeah, I can add to that. We're fortunate here in Grafton, in the villages. We have ordinances, and there's one for septic pumping. I believe it's every 4 years, but the town office does keep a running record, and letters go out when a person needs to have their septic pumped. I don't know if Suzanne Welch is on, but they're doing a water study, and they're doing a survey actually next month, going to homes about their own septic systems, where people need to have that information. What kind of septic system do you have? When did you have it last checked? A series of questions. So that survey is going to be giving the town of Grafton some more information.
That's great.
And who's doing this?
Grafton has a water study going on, and it's Suzanne Welch, and she has a committee here in Grafton.
Was that initiated through the select board?
Yes, it has, because we're doing another study of the water systems in Grafton. So if you contact Bill Kearns at the town office,
Mm-hmm.
he can give you information on the water study and certain people you may want to contact.
Thank you, Kathy. That was really helpful. And it's
Yeah.
a great example of what a community can be doing to help look at, I mean, it's hard when a lot of our communities and a lot of our residents who live in a watershed are not on village or town wastewater systems. Here in Saxtons River, if you're in the village, you're on a wastewater system, so we don't have septics, individual septics, but the vast majority of people who are in the Saxtons River watershed have their own individual septics.
Right.
So we have a couple minutes left before the end of this program, and I'm wondering if we have a chance for a couple more questions, if anyone or information that people are like, hey, I've always kind of wondered about this spot and the water quality there.
Mara, I just wondered if Marie had any additional comments on state regulations on septic systems. It seems it often only comes up in a property transfer, but not necessarily because of regular regulations, but people asking questions in a sale.
That is the case. The state regulates septic through permitting, and those permits, unless your septic system is officially failing, it will go until that property transfer happens. So the state doesn't get into monitoring septic pumping and things like that. But if a system is failing, or if there's water on the surface above a septic system and those issues are coming up, then the permitting requires that a new system be built or the problem be addressed. But it will not kick in unless there's a property transfer, if there's no issue.
So, but two questions is so many, particularly in places like Grafton, Saxons River, Rockingham, Westminster, some of these these septic systems predate the permitting process, right? And so where does that come in? Because I understand, towns or buildings or septic systems after they've been rebuilt, there's a septic plan that I think has to be on file with the state, right? And so but you have all these buildings that are older than that won't necessarily have that. And where's the threshold cross? And then the other one is, well, when does the state determine, and how does the state determine when a system is actually failing? Because I think that's the question we're trying to get at.
I'm not the wastewater folks, so I'll do the best I can. A failing septic system becomes pretty obvious. There's odor, there's leaking water. Sometimes you'll see really, really bright green grass where there is this problem and no green grass around it. And when there's a failing septic system, it usually causes problems in the house as well. So that's when people come to the state and say, this is a problem I have to get fixed, because the state has funding for that for income level folks. So we hear about those. We'll also get complaints from neighbors who have to deal with the odors and things like that. Other than that, as I said, it's not in the state's jurisdiction until there's a property transfer. So some of this, if the town is concerned about it, as they did in Grafton with that regulation, local ordinances, local regulation is where that would come in if you want to kind of keep track or be notified when there are those kind of issues, because the state doesn't have that authority. That's one of we do have programs, and I'll throw this out there. As Margot said, the modeling of nitrogen in the Saxtons does show that septic sources are one of the larger contributors. And as everyone knows, a lot of the villages have very small lots, not room for new septic systems, and they're right on the river. So that makes sense that that is a source of nitrogen. And the state has programs to assist towns to do, and will pay for feasibility studies to see if some sort of municipal wastewater system is feasible, what the needs are for that, what kind of system. They don't all have to be your typical wastewater treatment system for a small village. There's all kinds of ways to do that. And what the benefit of that is to a town is, so I live in a very small town right on the river, and people are now having problems selling their houses because of septic limitations. They can't put in a new septic system because the lots are too small. So there's programs that can help towns do that, and that's one of the things I will be addressing in the basin plan because of this information, is to try to get the word out that there are resources for towns to help with that issue. The last thing we want is people to be moving out of our villages because they are having trouble with their septic systems.
I'll just make a quick note that one of our neighbors recently is having problems with backup in her house, and she is on the sewer system in Saxtons River, and she had a company come out and found that her feed pipe from the house to the sewer system had been encroached on by tree roots, and so she had to dig up the entire entire driveway to put down a new pipe and take out, get the roots out of the way and put down a new pipe.
That's unfortunately not an uncommon problem.
I listened to a cool thing once that the trees can like hear the water running, and like they'll even grow towards a speaker playing the sound of water running. So they're really seeking out those pipes full of nutrient-rich water.
That's great study.
They're like really slow beavers. Well, we have hit the end of our time for this evening, and I really want to thank Marie for jumping in from the state. Peter, I'll get to you in just a second. I also really want to thank Ryan for coming and presenting this evening. Thanks SEVWA, the Southeastern Vermont Watershed Alliance, and all of the volunteers who monitor along the Saxtons River for your years of work. And it's, as Ryan said, I've been involved with SEVWA and monitoring along the Saxtons River for quite a few years, and it is exciting to finally see some of the data put together so that we can look at what's happening. Usually we just see the snippet from each year. All right, so before we officially close then, Peter, did you have a quick...
Oh, I just thought you or Ryan might want to put in a plug for more volunteer monitors, not just in the Saxtons River, but Williams and other rivers.
That's wonderful. Yes, thank you. And SEVWA, again, stands for the Southeastern Vermont Watershed Alliance. Ryan is the watershed coordinator, the water quality monitoring coordinator. Gloria, who's on the call this evening, is on the board. And I represent the Saxtons River Watershed Stream. I'm the stream team leader and help sort of coordinate the volunteers that monitor along the Saxtons River. So you can reach out to any of us. You can find me at Windham Regional Commission. That's probably the easiest, smoothest way to like reach out, and I can get you to the right person if you are interested. And we do always encourage volunteers to get involved, and I'm so glad to see so many of you here this evening. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent show. Very good job, Ryan. That was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey,
I
John.
did have a random question. Go ahead, Gloria.
No, I just said hi.
Oh, whoa, back. I did have a random question that I didn't want to bog everyone down with, but Looking at the whole watershed, I was wondering why no sampling further upstream than Stickney's, like in the vicinity of Cambridgeport or downstream of Grafton Village. But I didn't want to bog the whole conversation down asking that.
You know, it predates me, so I don't know if prior to I came on in 2013. If
Yes,
prior
well,
to 2013 that if it was sampled up there and determined it was fine, or we just started there because there's a swimming hole there and never went further up.
I
I
can
don't know.
speak to it a little bit,
But
and
it
I'm
would
sure
be
Marie
interesting to
will.
look at. Yeah, Marga.
Well, so lots of years ago when I was at the Nature Museum, I know that there was monitoring up in the Grafton area. I don't actually know why it was halted, but I think, and Marie, you might be able to confirm this, that it was likely due to the fact that the waters were showing, you know, that those sites didn't, as a priority level, didn't
Remarkably little.
be monitored as much as some of the downstream sites, which are capturing those upstream sites as well. But Marie, I don't know if you have more specific information.
I think when we started, we were monitoring up at like Lawrence Four Corners, kind of pretty far up there. And that's correct. You know, there aren't a lot of issues farther up. The water's in pretty good shape. We're actually, the upper Saxtons River is actually meeting very high quality water criteria. So what we try to do, there's limited capacity in the La Rosa program, so we can't run every sample everywhere. So what we look at is, what do we need to know? What are the problems we're trying to identify? So as was mentioned earlier, where we know we've monitored a number of times and the water is in good shape, there's no if nothing's going on up there, there's no reason to suspect that it's gonna turn bad on us. If we get a report that something's going on, then we can reevaluate that. But we have to keep within the limits of the capacity of the program. So we try to focus down and monitor where we know we're going to find something that's going to give us information we need.
Yeah.
So one of the things
Pretty
that,
much.
well, John, I was just going to mention that one of the things that the Saxtons River Watershed Collaborative is going to be looking at, and this is coming off of recommendations and things that have been noticed in the current status of the watershed, is potentially looking at working with towns like Wyndham and parts of Grafton to reclassify that upper part of the watershed for a little bit, you know, stronger protections than what it's currently classed at B2, just because the waters are so good up there.
The state has sites all the way up to, I'm looking at the list here, mile 9.4, Cambridge, upstream of the Cambridgeport Bridge. I think that might be the highest one up the shed. So we have sites up there, which is why we know it's in good shape.
If there's like a swimming hole or something that wanted to be monitored and the town was able to help support it, then that would be something we'd be open to doing also.
Yeah. Well, thank you all.
Those bacteria samples cost money.
Absolutely. All righty. Well, thanks very much. That was wonderful. Any future presentation, just a couple of words about why the bulk of the watershed is above the sampling regime might answer that question for anyone else that might care to. Anyway, excellent job, though. Boy, that was a tour de force presentation of a lot of data.
And he's about to do it again for the Green River watershed. So I want to be conscious and let Ryan get a quick break. So I'm going
to go eat a snack.
Officially end the meeting.
Next. Oh, my goodness.
See you in a little while.
All right. Have a great evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.